I'm going to introduce the speaker, and I'm going to pull up my cheat notes for that. I'm going to... Yeah, Scott, we have never met. We have met, so I'm very excited to introduce Scott to us, who is a senior Agile coach at Percipio Consulting Group. And I have met Scott years back at one of the Lean Coffees. It's a great discussion, always with great Agile minds, very inspiring. But even in such an inspiring group, you stood out as somebody who was just extremely thoughtful and curious and approachable. So I then was lucky to our paths crossed again, and I even was able to work with you just for a short period of time, side by side. And I have to say, you always amaze me at your endless thirst for knowledge and quest for knowledge. Anytime I find a book and I'm like, hey, Scott, have you read that book? He goes, yeah, and have you read that book? And I'm like, no, I have not read that book. And he does it in the most wonderful way, and he always stays humble and approachable and curious. So there is never any, yeah, I know that, done that, tell me something else. So I really appreciate that, and I learned a ton from you. And with that, I am handing it over to you, Scott, and I'm very excited. Thank you for the time to share with us your Wardley Mapping knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks. So first, I would like to say thank you to Nora and Jean, who were my guinea pigs for this talk, as I was preparing it for Tim and Willard, who are with Percipio. And also Sasha, I think I ran this by you. In fact, if you haven't seen this yet, you're one of the few that I haven't beta tested on. So there's a lot of information here, and different people have offered many, many suggestions. So it's really a collaborative effort. We're all going to get through it together. So you can see on this first slide here that there are quite a few large claims about how good Wardley Mapping is and all the things that it can do for you. I'll try to back some of those up, but these are actually Wardley's words, as you'll see at the end. And someone suggested having an itinerary for a trip through maps seems like a good idea. So we'll start with some of the foundational concepts. Wardley Mapping draws from a lot of different areas, and so we don't really want to go deep into that in introduction, but I'll try and touch on most of them. As well as the business maps, which are in use today. Those will look pretty familiar to most of you here. And then how to build a Wardley map. We'll go through some value chains and evolution of them. We'll choose the methods and teams, and this is one of the sections that gets a lot of attention from Wardley Mapping. Pioneers, settlers, and town planners. And then we'll go through how to predict transformational shifts, how to update your maps through the strategy cycle, putting it all together, and then a little anecdote about communicating with maps, and then getting started on your own. And then we'll watch a very brief 2-minute video by Simon Wardley on mapping itself, and then we'll move on to the discussion. So, ready? Here we go. So the foundational concepts, we're going to start really deep. The world is competitive. It has always been competitive, and competition forces change. It's always forced change, and change is normal. As I mentioned, it relies on a deep theoretical framework from many different disciplines. Most companies will listen to the highest paid person in the room, the loudest voice, the CEO, but not really running strategy sessions for the sake of strategy. One thing to remember with Wardley maps is that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And all maps are imperfect. A perfect map of Portland would require a 1-to-1 scale, very difficult to fold and put in your pocket and carry around. Maps are a means of learning and communicating with each other, and in my experience, this is the main benefit of Wardley maps, that you get to the communication part very quickly, making explicit understanding, group shared understanding over implicit understanding with individuals. And the map represents a moment in time. It's just a snapshot, and reality is always changing, so you have to go back and update your maps very often. Business maps commonly used today lack landscape and climate considerations. We're very good at navel gazing in companies. We look internally at what's going on and think abstractly about the outside world. So Wardley has a convenient definition of what a Wardley map should include. It should be visual, context-specific, a positioning of the components relative to an anchor, and a movement of those components. And if it doesn't have those 6 things, it's not a Wardley map. So a common systems map that you might see here looks fairly familiar, doesn't meet the definition because there's no relative positioning of the components to each other. There's no anchor and there's no movement of those components through time. Similarly, a business process map lacks positioning and movement. It does have an anchor though. And almost counterintuitively, a mind map meets most of those criteria, lacking only movement, but it doesn't really help as much with coming up with what the next thing coming is. So on a Wardley map, the customer is always the anchor. They're very focused on user need. So components are arranged below them in a hierarchy of needs. This is the first step of value chains. So if you're familiar with Lean, you've seen value chains before, and they're not new. But components are points of capital, and the lines between are flows of capital. So you might think of where you're spending your money now and how you fund those things. For example, the components are positioned by customer visibility on the vertical axis, but each of those components is connected by needs. So in this example, a customer needs online image manipulation, which needs photo storage, which needs a website, which needs a platform, the ability to compute, data center, and power. But the customer isn't very interested in where you're getting your power from. And if your power goes out, the only thing they care about is I can no longer use my image manipulation. And most of the early maps that I'm showing here are early Wardley maps from 2005. He was running a photo company in Europe for a 3D television company. So the value chain is the vertical axis of a Wardley map. It shows how you deliver to customer needs. And so the most visible components are at the top and the least at the bottom. The horizontal axis is a little more complicated, as Michael and I went back and forth on Agile PDX for about 25 comments. It is driven through evolutionary patterns and starts in Genesis, where an engineer comes up with a new idea. No one really understands it, maybe a few people. Then you move through custom built, where if you want it, you've got to build it yourself, into a product state where things begin to be improved, and it rises in ubiquity. As you can see, the evolutionary pathway there shows that it's becoming more and more visible, and then eventually to a commodity. For example, you might think about a telephone. When the telephone first came out, it was a wonder in the world, and people talked about it in that way. By the time everybody had a telephone in their house, they didn't come with instructions anymore. Similarly, when the Wright brothers built their first plane and managed to fly 500 feet in Kitty Hawk, not many people had much use for that. It's a cool thing, but it wasn't all that useful for most people. And then the German Air Force said, probably drop bombs from above with that thing, but they couldn't go to the Wright brothers to have them build the Air Force for them, so they had to build it themselves. And that unleashes a feature race. So suddenly companies are one-upping one another and improving upon the basic idea of a fighter jet. And what that kicks out is some more commodity type behavior. Now you can rent a seat on a flight between two cities, and it becomes more useful and people understand it more. Still a luxury item at that point, but the increasing competition continues and drives down the cost of the commodity until on the war side, you eventually build a $300 million fighter jet, which is potentially taken out by an army of drones. So as the fighter jet company reaches that plateau, it isn't able to retool very quickly to become the drone company, and that moves it back into Genesis. So that evolutionary phase driven by competition with increasing utility, increasing ubiquity, and lower profit margins is the horizontal axis of a Wardley map. And now we are reflecting value chains along those climactic patterns because we've taken the basic value chain and stretched it across an evolutionary pattern. And we've finally met all the conditions for a Wardley map. So each component's location also gives you some idea of its anticipated evolution as things move from the left of the map to the right through the phases. We can expect that the middle period where the feature race is going on is highly competitive. But as you move into utility, like that 1.8 or the $300 million fighter jet, there's inertia to change. They can't retool, they can't compete quite as easily. And the positioning of each component has inherent characteristics. On the left side of the map, toward Genesis, things are uncertain and unusual and rare, poorly understood, like a wonder in the world. And off to the right, they're low margin, they're ubiquitous, they're well-defined, there are best practices involved. So each of these patterns suggests that using a particular methodology is best for that component. Not in all cases everywhere. There's no one-size-fits-all. But off to the left side, you might expect Agile, learning through failure, trying and reiterating through different things as you learn what's working, to be the best method for Genesis and early custom-built components. In the middle, you're going to see Lean be more effective, keep your inventories down, be very competitive. And then as things become more utility, only Six Sigma and sort of traditional best practice behavior assures no failure. So on the left side of the map, you might consider the teams working on those components to be pioneers. They're the type of people who really like to learn and try new things. And, you know, they're not disappointed by failure. And the failures that they should be doing are safe to fail. They try things and they fail and they come back and try new things. In the middle, the settlers are operating, and they're much more lean-based. They're trying to keep the business running. And off to the right, you have town planners, more likely to run a factory. So Wardley suggests that there's an ecosystem that will be good for your company or for different endeavors that shows that pioneers will steal the components from the town planners from the previous evolutionary pattern, and the settlers will steal that from the pioneers and productize it until the town planners make it a utility. So the pioneers are likely to build a janky, partially functioning 3D printer with Lego. And in the middle, the settlers are likely to take that 3D printer and make it stable, make it something someone wants, shine it up, make it a good marketing ploy, and the competition starts. Whereas the town planners are most likely to be running the Lego factory. So each of these three phases also have inherent characteristics. And the important one to see here, although there's quite a bit of interesting stuff on this slide, diving in on that, the hero worship piece kind of describes this very well. Steve Jobs would be an example of a pioneer. He brings a new thing into the world, never seen the iPhone when it came out. Machiavelli, kind of known for competition, kind of cutthroat competition. And Jeff Bezos puts entire industries out of business as he brings it into his ecosystem. So they're really brilliant people in each space. No one thing is better than another. And Wardley's suggesting that as you develop teams within your organization, you should consider their aptitude and attitude and try to put them on components which match that. So the team piece for Wardley is drawn from the Air Force. Colonel Dan Ward has written a book, which was updated in 2014, called Fast, Inexpensive, Restrained, and Elegant. And that's basically using the famed two pizza teams and Spotify's squad model of having small teams which own the innovation all the way through production. It breaks complex systems into small bits. Large groups have larger and higher costs of communication and slower moving, lower productivity. But the visibility and accountability means that nobody can really fade to the background in a small team, and there's less waste and duplication overall. So what is suggested is that we use small teams with the appropriate method. We cultivate the right culture so that the pioneers are all potentially agile, insourced, and the town planners, where there's low margin and low tolerance for failure, is outsourced to other companies, and the lean in the middle is the operation of the business. So they suggest that when you have a Genesis component, you're really bringing something new into the world. You don't want to outsource that learning. You don't want to pay another company to figure this out for you. This is what your company is potentially birthing into the world. So the learning and keeping that in-house is very important. Whereas if it's power, you probably should trust PGE with that rather than trying to build your own power station. And then he says that forecasting transformational shifts is possible with this. If you think about that jet company again, it's going to have to figure out how to survive as there are fewer and fewer of those in the world. They have teams building systems within systems within systems. It's a huge endeavor, and it's not very agile, not easy to move around, not easy to change things around. But if you want to have a drone company, you have a lot of money now as the fighter jet company. So I believe Boeing just bought a company out in Hood River, I heard, for drones. And the drones are the components that come out of the last war. So as the inertia builds up and the war happens, there's a lot of corporate casualties, and just a few companies survive that. For example, these new components that come out of that war are used to do new and interesting things. Like you've seen drones for bridge inspections, Amazon Prime Air, heard about deliveries with drones now, and AI is now starting to come into drones. So those things weren't possible in the Wright brothers era or in the early German Air Force era. But once you get to the components being cheap and inexpensive, you can enter an age of wonder. And they're built with those components, which were previously too costly to be able to consider. If we were going to build a toaster today and go out and source the metal, it's going to be a pretty expensive toaster. You know, we can go to Target and get one for $11, or we could build one ourselves, which is probably going to be a fire hazard and melt, because all of the components of a toaster are built on previous innovation cycles. And in the middle, it's a relative period of peace, and competition is going on. Companies are one-upping one another, but they're not generally going out of business while they do that. So Wardley, in 2014, came up with the Peace, War, and Wonder cycle of predictions within the IT space. He used ages, which he centered around a cluster of these innovations that were built in the last war. And the innovations go through the cycle of diminishing returns and widespread adoption, which is the period of peace, and then the inertia begins to build up and starts the next war. So in 2014, he came up with this document. Many of his documents look like this. I apologize for so much information in such a small space. But the important part here is a blockchain. If you look 2018, right where we are now, we're entering a period of war, which 4 years ago was completely blue in his 2014 prediction, and not in a revolutionary period, whereas the way Bitcoin has been behaving, you could easily say that is a war now on currency itself. So let's give some thought to where we've gotten to so far, because that was a whole bunch of information. We've given thought to where things are currently. We've observed what's going on. We've considered where they're likely to go with the forecast and the patterns for evolution. We've assembled small teams. We've decentralized decisions to speed things up within the company. And we're ready to invest. So using a Wardley map, where would we do that? It's kind of hard to know. So Wardley suggests the OODA loop from Colonel John Boyd. John Boyd's OODA loop, this is actually the OODA loop that he came up with. It's quite brilliant and in-depth, and this is one of those things that we also won't be diving too deeply on, was built for fighter pilots to make split-second decisions, because in that competition, disaster's pretty big deal when you lose the fight. So usually, because it's a business-focused OODA loop that you usually hear about, it looks like this. It's a little simpler, and it kind of gives some basic instructions. First, you observe. You take into account your changing environment. So now you're not navel-gazing. Now you're not just thinking about inside your own company, but also the landscape outside of it. So you take those changes in, and your mind becomes an open system. You try to teach your people and your troops the right training so that they can succeed in that changing environment. But the danger is what you give them as doctrine on day one becomes dogma after that. So you have to teach them how to think in the moment as well, which was the point of the OODA loop in the first place. And you never stop reorienting as you go through. So moving forward with our best hypothesis, we decide which one will work. And action is how we find out if our mental model was correct. And it said that the organization that can go through successful consecutive OODA loops faster than their opponent will win the conflict. You may often hear, get inside your opponent's OODA loop. So if you're orienting faster than your opponent, you can respond to things that they're doing in the marketplace. Wardley also draws on Sun Tzu's 5 factors. The purpose is why people follow you, what you're doing, why you do it, and it's the moral imperative of the operation. The landscape is the environment in which you're competing. The climate is the forces which act upon that environment. The doctrine is the training. You want to give them as useful patterns as you can because it is going to turn into dogma. Focus on user needs is a fairly safe and useful training in every case. Challenging assumptions, being transparent. And then the leadership is what you do with the 4 other factors. Once you've taken all those into account, what should your action be? So Wardley combines both the OODA loop and Sun Tzu's 5 factors into the strategy cycle, which combines both the why of purpose, so why are people following you and what leadership choices do you make, with the why of movement. Why did you make that choice based on this landscape and that climate and this training? So putting it all together, this is the difficult part, and this is the hard part to wrap your head around. You get the Wardley map, you've created the small teams, and you've figured out where your components are and how you're funding those components and what needs drive the value chains, and you're at step 1. So cultivating the right cultures, training your people, it's all right in there. Then you consider the climate list. Wardley has helpfully provided 27 different known business climates in this graphic here that you can choose from to figure out which one you're operating in now. Of useful doctrines, there are 40. So these are different training patterns. There was actually an interesting Twitter thread recently where people were coloring in the doctrine, the training for your company, whether red, yellow, or green. Old banks and large utilities were primarily red in their current training patterns, whereas startups might be more transparent and more agile in the training section anyway. And then of the gameplays that you can put into play when you think of all these different things, 68 different patterns are identified and suggested by Wardley. And then you start the OODA loop again. So you start going through a new map based on what you learned in the last strategy cycle. And as you go through this again and again, that's the OODA loop that you have to do faster than your components, to keep an eye not only on how your people are trained and how they're operating within the components and the teams that they're operating in, but how the outside world is changing. Because if you're building the wrong thing or in the wrong environment, very likely to fail. So there's no easy answers with maps. There's often feedback loops and hidden surprises, but you can get better at it by practicing. And what you practice, where your attention goes, is where the energy flows in the system. Maps adapt as things are discovered, and all maps are still imperfect, just like they were at the beginning. But now we have one mechanism, at least, to anticipate change and learn new things as they're discovered. But the conversation around building a map is priceless. After my first pass with Willard and Tim, we went through a mapping session, and it wasn't clear if it was a benefit or not. You know, we're like, okay, that's cool, but how do we use it? The next time I did it, Willard started asking me some really pointed questions about how I constructed the map, and I was like, wow, I didn't even think about that. And that was really what the real value of the map was. It wasn't just in my head anymore. Now we were talking about a thing that was up on the screen. So similarly, I have this little anecdote prepared in a self-driving car company about communicating with maps. It's about a meeting that takes place between finance and IT. Our finance department considers themselves to be among the best in the business. They are flashy, stylish, wealthy folks who know what's going on in the world. And IT, of course, sees themselves a little differently than that. They believe that they are the magical elves that can provide all of the solutions through their magic in the world. And now finance doesn't exactly see them that way, nor do they see finance that way. In fact, they see finance a little more like the Gringotts elves, kind of stingy. They don't really want to give the money to fund the thing that they need to do. But finance doesn't also see IT as a bunch of shiny elves, more like cosplaying children. And what's important here is how they see each other. Those are barriers to communication, right? They don't trust one another. So a map takes it out of the context of what they're bringing to the table and lets them talk about what the best thing for the company is. So from the perspective of finance, when IT rolls out their systems map, their network topology, and asks, should we outsource this thing or build our own? A or B? They don't really know. And now you're seeing it from finance's perspective that it's written in Elvish, but the very same information put into a Wardley map, should we outsource A or B? Anyone care to take that one? A, outsource A, because it's the utility, right? So even without any more information than we had on the last slide, we can make decisions about what we're talking about here and what's important. And we add the English in, we can see that GPS is not something we should build ourselves. It's on everybody's phone in here. So the world perception server, the way as a car navigates through the world, is the new thing, and that is the learning that the company should keep insourced. So as we move on to beginning to do this ourselves, it's best to start with a fairly simple map, what the customer cares about. This is the map for a cup of tea. If the power goes out, they only care they don't get their cup of tea. But it's a fairly easy map to construct. This is just a value chain, not a map actually, in that it lacks movement. But it does give the first step of how to create a map for yourself. It basically is 3 steps. You identify the user need and create a value chain on how you will address it, and then take the components and that flow and move it across the evolutionary cycle. And there is some emerging community around these maps, which one gentleman was kind enough to actually watch this for me remotely. He's from Pittsburgh, and he had a very interesting interaction with Wardley on Twitter about his real-time board template. He had created this template in real-time board, which is a whiteboard, online whiteboard tool for mapping. And you can see Wardley's reaction here. He suggests he even has inertia. He didn't see the value in it immediately. But these are basically the steps that you go through. You talk about what the scope of the map is. Is this a map of one team or one project, an RFP, or the whole company? And then what's the purpose of the mapping? What are we trying to learn? We move on to what the users of this technology are, or this innovation are, and their needs, and list those out. We build the value chain with those needs to see how we will meet them and what they care about, and then we spread those across the evolutionary axis. And to the point of enabling better conversations, Ben has also built this evolutionary characteristics cheat sheet, where he took one of those earlier Wardley slides and built this tool so that as you're talking about these different components, you can say, oh, well, this is actually in the rare space, or maybe, this has, required, we're still learning to use the thing. And so you highlight them as you move it down, because like a telephone, the way you talk about a component can help you place it on the evolutionary axis. You may not get it right. You may have to move it around and try different things. But what I found is as I'm moving the components around, I start to think about the perspective of that particular component, and that changes my understanding of the overall map. So that is some of the things that are emerging on Twitter and in MapCamp and Slack, tools that help you use and understand Wardley maps a little bit better. So with that, we will let Mr. Wardley himself explain what he believes the value of mapping is.
Mapping, I suppose the best way of describing in terms of impact is imagine you're playing a game of chess and you've never before looked at the board. Mapping shows you what the board looks like, so it rapidly improves your ability to play the game. I've done this within government for things like high-speed rail, Home Office, the police, immigration, border control. Then we've done it within pharmaceutical companies, media companies, so all sorts of different industries. There's a couple of immediate impacts. First, it gets everybody to focus on the user need. So you often get projects, big specifications, very difficult to understand what the user need is. Maps provide a visual way of seeing that. Secondly, it teaches you about how to apply multiple methodologies. So rather than being, Six Sigma outsource or Agile insource, you learn to break down large projects and use multiple methods, and that can lead to enormous cost savings and risk reductions. The other part of that is actually risk reduction itself. By mapping out the environment, we've had huge, these are billion-dollar projects where they discover that the contract arrangement is not ideal. The other thing mapping is great for is communication. Most of the business IT alignment issues people talk about are usually artifacts of how we organize and poor ways of communication. Mapping is a way of everybody being able to see what is going on in the landscape, and we found it has really simplified communication in large organisations. So beyond saving costs, applying the right methods, focusing on user needs, improving communication, risk management, it's also fantastic for strategic planning, situational awareness. So there's actually a whole host of other techniques of learning about how the economy is changing, learning about how you can improve your environment based upon competitors' actions, which come into play as well. The comments we get back are generally fantastic. I say generally. I've never had a negative comment.
So you can see I took the intro slide from that video right there about all the benefits of mapping. And I will make the deck available. Here's some other resources that you can look into. Some of Wardley's keynotes are very entertaining. He uses more slides than the 103 that I just showed you. And goes back to the Peloponnesian War, for instance, to explain the benefits and lack of innovation of the SWOT diagram. And Ben Mosier's evolutionary characteristics worksheet is at his website, Hired Thought. The Atlas 2 mapping tool is Wardley's consultancy leading edge forum. Actually lets you build your own Wardley maps and move the components around and make the connections yourself. Some of the legend that goes with these maps is included here as well. And I see there are a few questions already, so that's good.
So this was easy. So we're here as Agilists tonight. Can we use this in our Agile stuff? Can it help us guide a transformation, an Agile transformation? Can it help us unscrew a screwed up $2 billion project with 400 people working on it? Can we use it? Something like that?
Yes, I believe so. It helps you to understand where your team is or where your company is now. And the thought that goes into constructing the initial map takes quite a bit of work. To have a map that stands up to scrutiny, especially Willard scrutiny, is quite difficult. But the conversations that arise out of that may uncover opportunities and risks that you have in your Agile teams at the team level or at the corporate level. We've mapped out some contracts as well as companies. You can map for your competition even to make a sense of their organizational structure.
And how durable are these maps?
It's a snapshot. It is only a moment in time, and as reality changes, they suggest that you move through the OODA loop to update what the map looks like so that you update your understanding. The topic that Michael and I were going back and forth on was the combination of Cynefin and Wardley mapping for team maturity. So in different areas, that horizontal axis can change a little bit for practice or for data. And you might use a novel practice followed by an emerging practice, followed by good practice, followed by best practice instead of the evolutionary scale that he suggests. So as you decide that what we do now is best practice and we should always do it that way on our teams, that would be over to the right-hand side in utility. Everybody knows how to do that and should do it this way. Wardley mapping is probably in the Genesis space as we came to the conclusion on Agile PDX.
It's not like a strategic plan for a year.
I would say no. Small batches more often.
So this is the time when you refresh your glasses and we come up and vote. You've got your 3 votes. Grab a pen. All 3 votes on one Post-it. This is going to help us prioritize because some of the answers to some of these questions might be long.
Might be, yeah.
Okay. Put a check mark or a dot, and please rush forward, or I'll have to drive you out of your chair.
I've seen her do it. It's not, you should run now. Thank you all very much. All right, our first question is avoiding bias in classification in the map. Tips, tricks, and is that just life?
It's a good question.
Okay. It can be yours. What I have experienced is that my biases show up on the map and then are questioned by other team members as we're talking about the map. That first map can be done as a group. I think it may take a little longer when you're trying to balance all those to go into it. Sometimes people find it easier to react to something that's already built. But it does expose those biases. In fact, Gene threw me a softball on Twitter the other day asking about it, and I said, it's really good at exposing the elephant in the room. Oh, hello, Jumbo. And then Wardley retweeted that. So I think the idea is that you may have something that you're all not thinking about, you know, in your organization or in your team or in your project. We uncovered on a contract that the term of the contract wasn't really long enough to accomplish all the stuff that they wanted to do. It looked fine when it was on the length and scope line and all the activities, sure. But when you put the two together and had it on a map, it became very clear that you couldn't accomplish it in that time. Yeah, sure. That's the done column. Models and maps aren't perfect. How do you keep that foremost in the team's mind?
Michael.
Shocking. I think you make that explicit right from the beginning, that, you know, this is just a snapshot of reality today, that we have to go through the consideration of what the other factors that we're facing are and how that changes over time. In the maturity model mapping, as you learn new skills, it would require a new map. It wouldn't reflect your reality anymore. So if you had other skills to learn or to build on what you'd previously learned from the last iteration, then that's where you make it explicit to the team that we'll be updating this on a regular cycle. All right, 2 down. Are there characteristics of settlers, pioneers, and town planners that help your team identify how they're acting? Who's this?
Who's the questioner?
Yeah. I think there are characteristics that you probably have a mix right now. Wardley suggests attitude and aptitude in constructing the teams, but he also says it takes 5 to 10 years to get a company there, to get the right people on the right teams. I think that I discover things about myself all the time. You know, I prefer to be in the Agile space. I prefer to be learning through failure because I'm really good at failure. And I can learn things from that. If I have to do best practices, if I have to do the same thing every time, my attention wanders. And that can be catastrophic on a settler team. Yeah, sure.
Did that answer your question, Rhea? Yep.
She nodded at me.
I thought she was agreeing with you. She's very agreeable.
How much training does it take to use these effectively? That's a good question. I'll be honest, the first time I heard about it, I was like, that's cool. I have no idea how to use it. And then I took the class and went, that's cool. I have no idea how to use it. So it was only after going through keynote after keynote, I was talking with somebody about that earlier, that sometimes when you watch the keynotes, it's not entirely clear that strategy cycle at the end, that these are the climactic patterns, and these are the competition patterns, and these are the training patterns. It's a lot of information to synthesize into figuring out how the map starts. But I think one thing to keep in mind with this is even though there's so many deep and complex inputs to the map, the output is simple enough to gain almost immediate context. And then you dive in on the conversation, you expose the biases, you start to talk about what the reality looks like for your other team members or your other company members. And then those conversations lead to a new map, lead to another one, lead to another one. And over time, through practice, you get better. Wardley said he felt like a fake CEO because he was charged with doing strategy, and he had never been trained in how to do strategy. And he picked up Sun Tzu and read that and like, well, that didn't help that much. But then as he started to look in these different areas and pull them together, he came up with this method. Came up with the idea that his platform that he was building for the open sourced photo company, he open sourced the platform or was intending to, and was speaking at OSCON, the 3D television company, scuttled that. They said, you're not going to open source this thing. We're going to go into 3D television. And that didn't work out real well for them. But the open sourcing of a platform was something that Wardley moved on to. He joined and started help mapping out a small company named Ubuntu that had 3% of the cloud market at that time. And when he left, it had 80. So he figured out that innovating and leveraging and then commoditizing the ILC gameplay that he often refers to was the best thing for Ubuntu to do. So they built the cloud and the cloud infrastructure, saw the innovations that people were doing there, and then commoditized it. So it takes a while to get them into a useful space, I would say, but through practice, it's possible. Sure, thanks.
Can you share all those references you were talking about, the keynotes you'd watched and so forth? Can you put them in the Slack channel? In a thread?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of them are. I think his most recent OSCON talk is in the slide, but I'll add some of the other ones in there. They're kind of scattered all over. It's really hard to gather them all together. But if you watch 40 Wardley keynotes, you too can do an intro to Wardley mapping presentation. Is the x-axis always the same? Does it or could it change by industry or need? Yes, it does change. I did post that one in the Slack channel already. There are at least 4 different, oh, I'm sorry, whose question was that?
Yes, I'm not reading the Slack channel.
You just joined though, I saw you in there. There are 4 different major areas, like I mentioned practice earlier, so that there may be a novel practice, an emerging practice, a good practice, and a best practice. He has that for data, for the evolutionary scale, and one more which is escaping me right now, but each of those have different x-axis attributes depending upon what you're trying to figure out. So like on the template where you talk about the scope and the purpose, that's where you would choose what the axis you were going to use was, in all likelihood. I haven't really done that, but that seems like the way I would approach it. Good? All right. Any of these others? Okay. No. I freed you. Did the Russians get inside the U.S. OODA loop? Any lessons for our business? Campaign contributions are actually tracked. That's good advice. They probably did. I mean, it's really not my area of expertise, but and whose was that? Not my area of expertise, but it does seem like that they took our existing campaign finance law and found ways to get inside of it, to make it more using the components that existed already. They turned it to their benefit and perhaps changed faster than we did in responding to those challenges. Man, I just guessed at that. How'd I do? Okay.
So just a quick comment, just a funny comment on that. Actually, when I was reading that question, so the drone to the $300 million fighter jet analogy came to my mind. Mm-hmm. So the Russians used the drones to basically take away the $300 million fighter.
Yeah, exactly. We were moving slowly. We had an expectation that this was the reality that we had, and that's a very good point, because past success breeds inertia. When you're succeeding, why would I stop succeeding to consider where I'm at and where I'm going? Well, you could have entered the utility phase, and maybe that the things that you've put out there already can be used against you. Thank you. Startup versus mature company. Do the map the same? I would say no. It's very likely, I would say, in a startup company versus a mature company that you're going to have more Genesis-based components, potentially. And if you think about like maybe Uber, right, versus taxis, right? So taxi medallions were a very valuable thing in New York forever. And when Uber came in, suddenly the value of them was not quite the same. So I think in a mature company, the map will probably be moving more to the lean and toward the utility side. And the change could be more catastrophic for a company that's not really paying attention to those stable and profitable components.
Who was that?
Forgot whose that was. Oh, yours?
You've got a question.
And did I get it? Okay, cool, thanks.
There's a question.
Oh, question?
feel free to defer if this goes way too deep into what you're just saying. You mentioned the Cynefin framework earlier, right? And I know a key part of the Cynefin framework is that once I get into simple, where I have best practice and I commoditize and I standardize, that I can spill over into chaos. And if I spill over into chaos, as opposed to having a controlled move, I'm in a very bad way because I can't go back. Right. Do you see that represented in this model as well? I guess what I heard you saying kind of started to touch on that concept. I was curious.
In the best practices team maturity article that was just a keynote like last week at a Lean Agile, I think it was Scotland maybe, or Glasgow. They were talking about the combination of the two. They mapped out the team's current responsibilities and the skills that they needed to meet the user needs, found the ones that they were less strong on, that were more toward the Genesis component, and then took those and placed them on stickies into the Cynefin framework. That won't help me answer your question because there were none in the chaos space. But that's how you might use those two things together. I was actually referring to tipping over from ordered into chaos because then you just have to act to get out of that space, and you actually can't go back to best practices. You've got to figure it out from going all the way around the Cynefin framework to get back to something simple, if you can. So once you've tipped over the edge in Cynefin, and I am not an expert for sure, but when you tipped over into chaos, then you just have to behave immediately. You've got to act to get out of it, and hopefully get to a repeatable cause and relationship between cause and effect, even a networked one that might be in the complex space. Get that one? Okay, thanks. Do disruptors usually happen in the space bordering commodity? And what did you mean by, so do you mean in the...
So if it's not a good question, it was his.
Okay. Thanks for coming. We needed you today. Probably most.
Well, thank you. It's just in line with what we were talking about, where sometimes you feel like the taxi market, it reaches a maturity, and I saw this inertia bar there, and everything seems to become static and just it's very commoditized and forward. And then something else happens, somebody else enters that space. So Uber enters the space, or Amazon enters the space and disrupts everything, or Airbnb disrupted this very stable and commoditized way of renting out rooms. And so it's just interesting to me where that is and how these companies become so mature and then stay there, and then they get kind of busted open. So
yeah, I think that his transformational cycle suggests that coming out of utility, that the corporate casualties that occur and the lower profit margins enable those innovations.
So, in fact, just to kind of reiterate on that point, so classically the inflection point, that's the exact definition of inflection point, is that when you basically reach that maturity stage and now a disruption comes in, and then disruption basically goes like Uber to the medallions versus like, Amazon to the kind of classical stores and so on. So the inflection point is where like, I think the mapping basically exactly like, kind of maps to that older methodology also. So.
Yeah, it exposes that that context, that as you've been in the competitive one-upman stage, no companies are really probably going out of business, or few. But as you leave the commodity into utility phase, only a few survivors. That's where the corporate casualties happen. That's where the components are generated that are less expensive that you can build the next thing on. Did we get that one? Okay, thank you. Isn't this Adam Smith only written or described in terms of modern technology?
We've got to follow on the last one.
Oh, okay. We'll come back to this one in 1 second.
So my question had to do with another kind of disruptor, like climate change, which will affect companies, and we don't know exactly how, but I mean, companies may just have to move, or we don't know, but they're going to have to deal and come up with solutions to problems that we might be able to anticipate, but we might not.
Right.
So how?
Well, when you bring the context of climate change in to the climate discussion, to the landscape discussion, the the placement of that component. Like, what are you doing about it now? Are you addressing it? Is it something to consider? And these are meant to be very rapid rebuilds of the map. You know, what have we done now? Let's make the decision to make this move about it, and we'll examine how that went. Very agile in that way. Look at the outcome, and then make a new map for how we've moved in regard to the climate change. What else have we learned about climate change? How does that continue to impact us? So it allows you to make explicit, perhaps, that elephant in the room that nobody's really thinking about. You know, that they may just be behaving as if it's still going to be the same summer, winter, fall cycle.
Was the same kind of thing 30 years, 40 years ago.
Right. And that would be, so if you were mapping for OPEC, you would start to consider perhaps we should invest in wind farms or solar farms or things like that. So other ways to get their user needs met that don't take into account their potentially dying model, right? So this one was, isn't this Adam Smith only written or described in terms of modern technology?
Well, I mean, Adam Smith said exactly the same thing. You have a commoditized. Adam Smith said essentially the same thing. When you have something that's commoditized, you sell it. Mm-hmm. And then you take that money from the sale and reinvest in high margin technology, which is your genesis. And that reinvestment potentially is a disruptor to that technology you just sold. But since you sold that technology, I think he recommended selling overseas, right? But since you sold it overseas, it doesn't matter, because once that new genesis becomes a commodity, you'll sell that and cycle out like that. So
I think you could find examples of this in other theories as well. I haven't heard Adam Smith mentioned specifically by Wardley, but I agree. I think it does actually take that into account, that as the profit margin goes down and things are well known and ordered and everybody understands how to use it, it probably can't be innovated upon within that space, that you have to start thinking about what the next transformational shift is coming up.
Yeah. Also, I just can't let Russia go by without suggesting that the Democrats are just sore losers. Sorry.
What would Wardley think of the KISS principle? Detroit Rock City? I think that in the output, it is fairly simple. I think that also that there are rapid cycles that would indicate that keeping it simple as you move through to try and iterate quickly, the things that enable you to move through the cycle more quickly are better in that regard, to try and get inside the opponent's loop. But I wouldn't want to speak for what he thinks, though. I'm just kind of guessing. Mm-hmm.
So it seems like, I mean, the whole, thank you. The whole process of building the map is very exciting and interesting, and there seems to be a lot of complexity in terms of building the maps themselves. And so how does that whole framework get maintained and stay current as everything continues to evolve? Does he address that?
Just through the strategy cycle, just through re-examining your context. I think that knowing the context is something that in the organizations and teams that I've been involved in, we're very much focused on what we're doing. And we think it's cool, but we don't really look outside as much to decide what might need to be done or what other people are doing and how we might respond to that if they beat us to market with this cool thing that we're doing. You know, so I think looking outside at the landscape and the climate is really the disruptive thing that is brought into visual context with the map. And then the conversations you have when you start talking about that are very, very valuable. And you can now understand the context. I think we had a question over here.
Mayor?
Actually, a comment on following on to his is one of the things that I see value in these maps bringing to the company is they allow you to update the movement of your company over time. And that's valuable in your quarterly business reviews or your strategic business reviews on a regular cycle, where you're looking at, did we shift? Did we make the move that we were trying to move? And did our competitors make any moves that we should be adjusting to? And so it gives you a framework for having those conversations and batting them back and forth much better than some of the other frameworks that are out there today. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
Yeah, help me. It looks like I got through them all.
Yeah, we managed to generate just the right number of questions because it's almost 8 o'clock. And oh, we have one more question, and you don't want to take it to the pub, huh? Okay.
I could. So I just wanted to ask if there's a mechanism in the mapping for accounting for unknowns, especially like when we're in the Genesis space.
I think you'd have to recognize that there was an unknown and then represent that in some way. But because it's unknown, it's hard to answer the question. Did you?
Sorry, I was going to say, how would you even know that there's an unknown there? And
right.
How would you then map it?
Are we in a Rumsfeld thing?
Yeah, in fact, I think we are. There's known unknowns, unknown unknowns, right? You know. Yeah. So I think if you have an unknown unknown, yeah, you would represent that on the map. Like, you know, I'm a healthcare company. Will Amazon go into healthcare? I don't know, but if it does, we should consider how that might affect our map.
You can tell an unknown if you have an expected result that doesn't work. You know that something happened that you didn't expect, and there's an unknown there, at least one.
Right, that could trigger another pass through the OODA loop, right?
Okay, now, any more questions? You really have to go to the pub. We have to be out of here, cleaned up and out of here before 8:30. And so notice that we've got cameras in various places. That's because we were recording tonight. And if you have friends who couldn't make it, in a reasonable amount of time, whatever that might be, this will show up on the Agile PDX website. And you can direct them there because we will tweet and let you know when it gets there. Thanks for coming this evening.
Thank you all very much.